hopefully I can give some good insights into what we're talking about when we say intelligent information management, and I will adhere religiously to the requirements that Uli gave. And if I stray too much into any marketing, just stomp on the floor or give me a signal. But I just wanted to start with the statement from Gartner. Again, a commonality between what Uli was saying. Hans, you're going to hear this a lot. ECM is dead. And I guess I don't think of that religiously, but I do think it starts a shift in the market and a new way of thinking that for us is an important point in time. And I want to talk a little bit about some of the characteristics of the new definition of the market, which is content services. And I think it's important to kind of think of these topics as we look at intelligent information management, as we describe it as well. And one of the first ones I think is a very key part of the shift is the idea that a single repository, that we're going to go put all of our information in one place, is going away. And a key defining factor of content services, as Gartner describes it, is the idea that, yes, systems in this domain will have their own repository, but they will also connect and integrate to external systems. So the idea that data does not reside in one place, or content or information, it's spread out among systems. I mean, think of the cloud today. Where is your data? Where is the information? It's often locations and systems, sometimes as data, sometimes as content. So that's happening to us every day. Another important characteristic is that content services, this new generation of ECM, if we want to call it that, is hybrid in nature. So on-premises has been the typical method that these systems have been deployed. We're clearly hearing a lot more about cloud as a very important deployment model, but also the notion that it can span both of those. So very often the idea that a company might invest heavily in on-premises infrastructure, but be looking for ways to exploit the cloud is a very common characteristic of content services. Another important point we're going to hear a lot about, I'm sure, I know one of the speakers is going to speak about this directly, is the idea of being able to automatically analyze and tag content. We all hear the AI word. It's a big word. It's a buzzword in almost every industry. It's clearly having a big impact today. We're seeing it working in actual deployments, so it's a fundamental part of this technology moving forward. And lastly, and this is a really important one, I think, is, and I'll just read this, content services include technologies that federate access to content across multiple sources, such as metadata layers. So the idea that metadata, or a layer of information, can connect content in different locations from different systems and put it in context. So what do we mean when we say in context? Well, if I'm in Salesforce and I'm working with a customer, that's the context I might be interested in looking at that. If I'm in an ERP and I'm maybe working with a vendor or an order, or I'm in a case management system, that idea of putting information into that context, a very important part of this. Now, another interesting point, and Gartner may have updated some of the data on this because I found this kind of interesting, is that even as late as 2020, only 20% of existing ECM systems, or enterprise file sync and share, so the boxes, the drop boxes of the world, and ECM vendors will morph into what we would truly call a content services platform. Now, I think it's going to move a little bit faster than that, but I guess that's starting to show that there's a lot of movement to be made in the ECM industry. There's a lot of the old way of doing things, and it's going to take a little bit of time for these systems to shift. Well, a very important part of this that we believe is that a driver is that the user, the customer's expectations have changed. Now, this timeline along the bottom, we're probably familiar with that roughly. The dates aren't exactly critical. You know, we went from a drive to paperless to the idea of organizing documents and controlling them in document management systems, moving to process automation. Well, that is accelerating. The demand for change, the impact of the cloud, mobile, the idea that I can get access to my information, and the explosion of information has truly changed how people expect to use data. I mean, what's driving the massive adoption of boxes and drop boxes? Well, it's easy. People can pick it up on their own. They can individually use it to benefit them in their daily work. That's driving these changes in the market towards what we're going to call intelligent information management. So the user, and not just, hey, we want to have a good interface for the user. That's an important thing. But to companies, the idea that the users, we need to attract good employees, forward-thinking employees, and companies that adopt technologies, that implement tools that are appealing and attract the user, that's going to be an advantage. It's not just marketing, it really is an impact. And I know in the US at least, the competition to hire good people is tremendous. I mean, it's exploding. I'm not so sure about all of the areas of Europe, but I believe it's challenging as well. So it's becoming extremely important in how we pull not just customers, we think of that as a vendor, but businesses and how they meet the needs of their users. So very important element. This is a slide I got from AIM, and I think it's interesting when we talk about the characteristics that drive us towards this notion of intelligent information management. And I'm not going to necessarily read every one, but you can see some of the characteristics. Information's exploding. I mean, how much do we all get every day? I mean, my email fills up before I even come in the morning. I didn't mention my company's a Finnish company, so when I get in the morning, I got a whole day of work from Finland sitting on my desk. But the explosion of information, the number of silos, all of the challenges that presents is a huge impact on business. I want to emphasize the second point too, content and data. You know, we often in this industry think about documents. Uli made a great point that documents, even as an object, are maybe going away. It's really data that's presented to us in maybe a container that looks like a document. But this idea of data, I think, is fundamental to the notion of intelligent information management because it's not just content. It's not just documents. It's the structured data that's in the CRM, in the ERP, in the accounting system, in the HR system that are fundamental to establishing context. This document, this contract's important to me because it's related to the customer I'm working on, or this invoice is critical because it's related to a project that's key to my business. The everywhere concept, again, I'm not going to harp on that, but the idea that think of that's where it's going. Where is the information going to reside? So a lot of very interesting changes. And I would just point to this at the bottom. You know, what do businesses really want? You know, they want to provide information timely to their customers. They want their employees to get access to what they need quickly and not just finding a document or finding some information, but literally getting to that information that's critical to the task right at hand and being able to use it and deploy it. Now, here's a little story that I kind of think helps paint some of the driving forces around this shift from the old monolithic, put everything in one system, ECM world, through content services and this notion of intelligent information management. And it's this idea that this wave is washing over companies, and IT is in the middle of that. All this information, all of these systems, new regulations, it's too much. And this is just pushing businesses in a direction that is forcing change, but finding that answer is maybe not so easy. Now, when we couple that with the idea of users' expectations, so not only are the demands on the business changing, but the demands that the users are putting forward. So, you know, it used to be when we came to work, we had the most powerful computer. You know, we could get access to the systems that we needed, and that was the state of technology we had. But we all know this today that I literally came into Berlin with no knowledge of where I was going or the location. picked up Uber. I mean, the sophistication of technology that we have in our personal lives is dramatically changing what's happening in the business world. And I know we're all exposed to that. Now, here's an interesting element. Well, what's the reaction of business to this, to the IT groups? Well, very often it's to control it, to constrain it. And this leads to a very interesting paradox. We call it the paradox of control. But the idea is that information is chaotically proliferating. We know that. Network file shares are everywhere still, even with all of these sophisticated systems. Or it's getting rigidly locked into certain systems. Maybe not just one, but that's the way we think of it often. But core systems that are driven from the top down. And what's interesting is the harder that IT tries to control, tries to lock that information down, the harder it gets. And again, I would just point back to the massive proliferation and popularity of file sharing tools. Why is that happening? Because it's not controlled top down, and the individual can basically work with information, data, perform their day-to-day work the way they want to. So that's a very interesting sort of dilemma that IT and businesses have to deal with. Well, again, we characterize this, and it's not just us. I mean, AIM has changed their name to the Association of Intelligent Information Management. And even though I have it capitalized here, I guess I have it all in caps, I don't even think of this really as a proper noun in English. I guess in German you capitalize all nouns, so you'll capitalize it anyway. But we think of it as just a term. You know, it's what would you do? How would you work with information? So we're not trying to describe this as a new category or a certain class of technology, but there are some characteristics of it, and it's about minimizing disruption as one of them. Minimizing and eliminating maybe the need to migrate data. We all know that in this space, migration is a key obstacle to innovation. What do? Some group wants to innovate. They've got an idea for how to improve a process. What's the first thing they have to do? They got to migrate all the data from one place to another. So working intelligently, we believe, maybe doesn't require that. So there's a real key characteristic there. The other idea of information and context, I know we hear this all the time, maybe too much, but this is really at the heart of it all. The idea that the information I receive is important to me at different times based on the context that I need it. Very important point. And the last, just to reiterate the earlier point about users' expectations, is that putting users in control. You know, that's that interesting idea of the paradox of control. How can IT maintain control to the extent the business requires it, maybe for regulatory purposes, governance, contracts should be stored here, records need to be maintained for this long. How do you do that, but also allow people to work the way they would want to work? And that literally to the individual, it's personalized in nature. The way I want to work with it is going to be different maybe with the exact way my colleague wants to work with it. And that, we believe, is the key to unlocking the value of information and really innovation. Again, I know we hear that word too much, but hopefully I can make a case for why that is a key part of this. Now, here's a graphic that kind of defines one view of intelligent information management. And I'm not here to make a point that this is the right view or the only view. There's lots of views, and there's lots of very successful vendors in the market who have different ways of doing this. But there are three characteristics we believe that make up the notion of intelligent information management. I'm going to point to the middle one first, the idea that it's system neutral in nature. It does not, at its core, require the information to move to itself or to one vendor or to a certain place. The notion of embracing content and data that's in other places. The third I'll point to is intelligence. Obvious, that's in the name. We all want to work intelligently. No one wants to work unintelligently. A key part of that is indeed artificial intelligence. The idea that as data is exploding, how are we going to get a handle on it and control it, manage it, make it accessible in context? AI is a key part of that, but quite honestly, there's numerous other elements, the connection to structured data, so key areas. And then I want to point to that first circle on the left, the idea of metadata driven. And the point I want to make there is that, in fact, let me move on and I'll explain this a little bit more. But the notion of metadata driven, in our view, is this idea that you don't put information in a location or in a system necessarily. You describe it and you relate it. And once you've done that, you've created the foundation for that information to show up dynamically based on how the individual needs to use it and different ways over its life cycle. And I'll get into that in just a little bit more. Now, what's interesting, I rearranged these circles here. And so it's really the 3 points: system neutral, metadata, intelligent. But the idea that the more those overlap, the more value an organization can extract from the information. It's a really interesting point. So imagine these circles. The force that a business would want to put is to drive those together. More AI or intelligence to quickly find data without manual interaction. The idea that I can simply tag it and that tagging would happen automatically, quite honestly. That's where the Holy Grail comes. And the idea can be anywhere, literally anywhere. And as that comes together, I mean, imagine if you could just as effectively utilize data that's sitting off in Box or in your SAP system or in your Salesforce system, and it's often maybe open text. So this idea that you can see how those start to come together, and we really believe that creates this drive for value, if you will. So I just want to emphasize this idea of metadata a little bit more. Some terminology that I find helps to cross the jargon gap, because the minute you talk about metadata, we've all heard it. It's not novel. I'm not trying to say that we need metadata and that's a huge innovation. The idea is that metadata provides this pathway to identify what's crucial in this information and allows me to then dynamically present it, maybe dynamically secure it. If something is identified as a contract, maybe only certain people see it. If something gets tagged with a project, maybe the people on that project team can automatically get access to that information. So now you put the power in the hands of the project manager. He just adds a new team member to say a project object. That project object is linked to the document, and now the permissions are automatically driven. So it's a very interesting concept. But the thing I would just juxtapose here is from this location-based paradigm, we will put things in a location. And imagine, that's completely subjective. A location-based approach. It's typically different not only between businesses, surely between industries it's different, down to the individual. We all think of that differently. So once you remove so any business, I would challenge you, or individual, you'll see a different structure, a different way we might choose to organize the information. So the key to the metadata idea, and again, it's not just a tag, it's the notion or some text that describes information by search, but literally it becomes a tool to organize and manage that information. These become relationships and objects that connect. So a project or a customer is not just a text string, it's literally information, an object that's fed out of a CRM generally, and then linked to a document or information to add context to it. So I was on this idea, though, of subjectivity versus objectivity. The idea of the location structure being very subjective. It matters based on maybe my preference or the company's preference, the industry. The idea that a contract is objective. I don't care what industry you're in. That's the same from an individual. You might call it an agreement, but it is objectively a contract, and it is objectively related to this customer. So the notion that now what comes from that? Precision. The idea of choosing a place to put something can be quite imprecise because multiple people will choose different places. The idea of defining something to be a contract related to this customer, everyone's going to get the same. And if you don't know what you're working on or what it's related to, that might be a bigger problem, but it's a very important element of this. And also just this idea that, again, access to information that can be anywhere in a unified way. So rather than I'm going to go off to my ECM system and I'm going to find this document and then I'm going to come to my CRM system and try to figure out the customer, and maybe I can even see some of those documents in the CRM depending on how they've been stored. A fundamental premise of this idea of intelligent information management is that in a unified way, one can access that information, again, in context, wherever it's located. And I want to bring up an interesting point here, and this is not me taking a jab at Box. In fact, I have extremely high respect for Box. They are a success by any measure. Huge public company, massive numbers of massive amounts of revenue. But I just want to compare differences of view, if you will, from various vendors in the market. But one of the interesting things that Aaron Levy said, their CEO, at their last BoxWorks was, they've had a lot of impact in the cloud, in mobile, and changing it. But he made a point of saying, hey, we haven't really changed how we work with information. I mean, think of it. It's basically a folder structure in the cloud. I know I'm understating that. And again, my point is not to make a negative comment. But I would point down to the comment made below by Jitu Patel, who's the Chief Product Officer. And the statement that he made was, a piece of content in Box is infinitely more valuable than a piece of content outside of Box. Now, I know they're marketing here. So again, my point is not to knock it or even to say what's right, but you can clearly see there are differing views on this. In this notion, the idea is that all of the information will go into Box. And if it's not in Box, it's potentially worthless. I mean, if it's infinitely more valuable, then I would argue the corollary is if it's not valuable at all. But I think that's an interesting point, that as we look at technologies, as we look at different vendors' approaches, how we want to intelligently manage information, we do have this idea of, do we have to move it to a certain location? Should it all be in one location? And I think that's an important thing to keep in mind. And this is intended really just to elevate the different views and thoughts around that. Again, bear in mind, I mentioned that intelligent information management, as I view it, is about it being anywhere. It's not about it all being in one place. So, important kind of comparison of those two ideas. I'm just going to talk briefly about this. It's kind of a similar image, but one of the ideas around intelligence we talk about with AI, well, you couple that with the metadata-driven idea, and you begin to now start to think of the notion of the Holy Grail, if you will. The idea that you could automatically, through AI, determine the defining characteristics of information with no manual intervention, and then it shows up based on where you need it in context. And this idea of AI is really starting to have a big impact on this, and not just finding text in documents. So obviously what this is representing is that one could go look in a document, apply AI to it, and basically perform text analytics and figure out characteristics in the document. Well, what if the defining characteristics are not literally written in the document? That's where you get into the idea of natural language processing and natural language understanding, where I can take a sentence and interpret that to mean it's related to this or that item. So really, really important part of this, and obviously intelligent is in the name, intelligent information management. I want to talk again about this idea of migration. I mentioned it briefly, but this new forward-thinking approach, if you will, or this idea of intelligent information management, I want to emphasize again, is the notion that migration is not required. And the idea that organizations can continue to leverage and take advantage of the investments they've made without disrupting others who rely upon those systems, and at the same time begin to repurpose and reuse that information that might be organized and managed in a wholly other system. So a really key characteristic of this is the idea that migration is not a critical element. And maybe even more important than that, I want to emphasize this idea of innovation. I talked about innovation. It sounds like a buzzword, kind of is in some respects. But what is one of the, if migration is one of the challenges of innovating in the way you manage information, what's another challenge? Well, a common one is there's a whole bunch of people who don't use the new system, who you've got to go convince to use the new system, and thereby it's a change management problem. So when we think about intelligent information management, the idea is that it doesn't require massive shifts of the organization to change at one time. And now you can begin to see how that connects to the notion of migration not being required. So if you could literally allow, where does innovation start in a company? Well, I would argue it doesn't start everywhere. It starts in certain pockets. And those pockets understand something that they want to improve. They want to do contracts better, or they want to do their records management better, or maybe they have some workflow they have to improve. Well, the stumbling blocks to that in the past would be you got to convince another bunch of people to do it. You got to migrate away from another system, so that's been a key challenge. So the idea that you could allow an individual group, at its extreme, it's literally an individual. It doesn't even have to be a department or a function. But the notion that you could allow a given function to begin to work independently, innovating, proving out concepts without requiring the rest of the organization to shift is a very interesting element to this. And I think it's one of the most important, because think how much organizations are being stifled in their creativity and innovation by not allowing groups to independently advance. Again, I'm going to come back to that example. And again, even though I put up this example about Box earlier, that's a perfect example of give people the freedom to do what they need to do, give them flexibility, give them the opportunity to advance their own sort of needs, and that's going to advance the organization. Therein is the paradox of control. If you could actually give users or small groups control while doing everything you need to do under the surface for governance and that's where innovation comes. It's not intuitive, I think, as we think about in IT, how to control information. So really, I'm going to wrap on this slide and just say it's an interesting time in the industry. There's a lot of shifts going on, AI coming in, the cloud impacting mobile everywhere, different systems proliferating. And there's just a really, to me, I live in Texas, so it feels like the Wild West. It's really lots of innovation happening, lots of new technologies coming to fore. So with that, I'm going to wrap because I think I'm used up my time. So thanks very much.